Splatoon as a series has always had a unique relationship with the concept of gender. It's one of Nintendo's few ongoing series without a defined protagonist, leaving the player the ability to create their own avatar, with their own sense of gender expression. It also has a primarily female cast, with only a handful of major male characters. The most prominent of these male characters are Captain Cuttlefish and DJ Octavio, who are relegated exclusively to the game's story modes, as well as Big Man, one of the members of Splatoon 3's mascot idol group, Deep Cut. The idols are by far the most important characters in the Splatoon lore, having some of the largest influence on the narrative in the story modes, online Splatfest storylines, and intergame series lore. And Big Man remains the only male idol in the series, outnumbered 6-1. Not that I have a problem with this. The games industry has an overwhelming problem of underrepresenting female characters in major roles, so it's nice to see a series that turns that assumption on its head. Especially with Splatoon 3 becoming more overtly queer than any previous game in the series, as representation of non-cishet identities is even rarer in the AAA space. Pearl and Marina are presented as even more overtly flirtatious with each other throughout their appearances in Splatoon 3 compared to their debut game, and the character creator removes the gender locking of particular options from previous games, as well as all use of gendered terminology. They even went out of their way to include both options of the amiibo-exclusive gear that had gendered variations in previous games. However, perhaps one of the most confusing and obscure aspects of queer representation in Splatoon is the characters who identify as non-binary, or rather, the characters that may identify as non-binary. See, there are a couple of characters in the Splatoon series with incredibly ambiguous gender identities, particularly Shiver, one of the other members of Deep Cut, and Acht, a major character in Splatoon 3's DLC campaign, Side Order. There's a lot of information to dig through on this topic, and a lot of it conflicts with each other, so I'm going to be researching as much as I can, gathering as much evidence for or against these two being non-binary, and see if we can come to some sort of definitive conclusion. Let's cover these two in chronological order. First up is Shiver. When the new headlining idol group Deep Cut was revealed as part of the Splatoon 3 Direct about a month before release, some people took note of the fact that in all of the game's marketing material, Shiver was not referred to with any gendered pronouns or other such terminology. A few sites, such as Nintendo Life, also reported at the time that the same was true for other localizations, as in languages like French, Spanish, and Italian, which specifically require conjugation of various different words based on perceived gender. All promotional messages regarding Shiver were worded carefully to avoid using such gendered language. That's not really something that happens on accident. Even in the game's original Japanese, despite the wildly different structure of that language, terminology typically used in a feminine context is particularly avoided. This led to widespread speculation on social media about whether or not Shiver might possibly be Splatoon's first canonically non-binary character, until all of that speculation was quashed later that month. Speaking to The Verge, Nate Bildorf, Nintendo of America's Senior Vice President of Development and Publishing, confirmed to The Verge that Shiver identifies as a woman, and uses she/her pronouns within the game itself. This would later be reaffirmed when the game was released, featuring a few scenes where Shiver is referred to by she/her. However, it's important to consider the source of this information, and a few other aspects of Shiver's portrayal within the game itself. First off, let's talk about Nate Bildorf. This guy started his career at Nintendo as a localizer back with the original Paper Mario, and his role on nearly every single game he's touched has been in that same department, at least when he's not voicing Shy Guys in the Mario games. As early as 2005's Chibi Robo, Nate Bildorf took over as one of Nintendo's localization managers, putting him at the top of the localization food chain for these games, so to speak. And his track record with localizing games is interesting, to say the least. He played a role in the original localization of Paper Mario: The Thousand Year Door, a game with significant differences in its localization between the original Japanese and English releases. One of the largest differences was the portrayal of Vivian, one of the game's antagonists, who eventually joins Mario to help take down her sisters. In the original Japanese release, Vivian was stated to be a transgender woman, and faces transphobic verbal abuse at the hands of her sisters, which is part of what convinces her to join Mario on his quest to defeat them. However, in the original English release of the game, this reference was completely removed, at least until the game was relocalized for its 2024 remake. This isn't the only instance of Bildorf having hands in a localization that heavily alters the original text, though. Case in point, Splatoon 2. Since the Splatoon games are a live service series, with each game receiving consistent content updates and limited time events for a few years after launch, we were able to see a significant shift in the portrayal of one of the game's major characters, Marina. In the original English translation of the game, Marina was portrayed as much more sarcastic and belittling to Pearl in their Ingopolis news dialogue, making lighthearted jokes at her co-host's expense. However, in the original Japanese, Marina was portrayed as a much more gentle and reserved character, though she could be a little sassy at times. The difference in personality between regions was initially very jarring to those in the know, and it seemed to be in an effort to recreate the dynamic that the previous game's hosts, Callie and Marie, had, specifically with Marina's localized personality being much more similar to Marie's. This was later adjusted when, seemingly due to fan backlash, subsequent updates and portrayals of the character, such as Splatoon 2's Octo Expansion DLC, brought Marina's personality much more closely in line with her Japanese counterpart. All of this to say, I personally believe that Nate Bildorf may not be a reliable source for information in regards to this topic, especially when this was not meant to be a major public announcement or correction. This was simply The Verge reaching out, asking if Shiver was non-binary, and a Nintendo executive answering on the spot. Sure, he is high up in the company, but who's to say what hand he did have in localizing the game, and if he even really knows for sure? Especially when games he's had more direct involvement in, like the aforementioned Thousand Year Door, have a history of erasing what little queer content was there. This isn't meant to be a judgment against Bildorf's character, as we have no way of even proving he was directly responsible for this change, but nonetheless, it's an interesting pattern that many of the games he's worked on have had far more drastic changes than some of Nintendo's other projects. And that's without even mentioning games with more controversial localizations he's worked on, like Fire Emblem Fates. The hints of ambiguity towards Shiver's gender in the original Japanese are made even more ambiguous in the English translation, but it's still overall clear to anyone looking for it that Shiver might have something going on with her gender identity, as the game is generally more direct about the gender identity and presentation of the other idols, even excluding the translation differences. And using she/her pronouns does not exclude Shiver from being non-binary. With all this information, I think the only real conclusion we can come to on the topic is that Shiver is maybe non-binary? I really wish there was a way to call it more definitively, but with access to what we know right now, we can't really make a more concrete conclusion than that. Honestly, it really comes down to whether or not you trust the word of a single Nintendo executive, as they haven't really confirmed or denied anything beyond this. In the case of Acht, though, things are a lot more cut and dry. It's not 100% confirmation, but there's a lot more evidence to the fact that Acht is non-binary than there initially was with Shiver. For those who are unaware, Acht is a character who originally played a minor role in Splatoon 2's Octo Expansion, where they had some minor background lore as a victim of the Kamebo Corp's brainwashing sanitization process. They composed most of the music for the game's soundtrack, under the stage name Deadfish. Now, at the time, Deadfish didn't appear in the game at all, only being referenced in some minor background lore, track names in the Squid Beats 2 minigame, and the Japanese-only art book for Octo Expansion, as well as some other promotional material for the DLC. In the English promotional materials only, they were referred to with she/her pronouns, despite other languages using gender-neutral or masculine terminology to refer to them. However, this portrayal would change significantly a few years later with the announcement and eventual release of Splatoon 3 Side Order. Acht, whose real name was now revealed for the first time, would be playing a major role in the brand new story mode, one of the first non-idol musician characters to do so, and oh wait, I get it, cause, Acht is German for 8, and the protagonist of Side Order is Agent 8, and they're both octopi. In addition to this, Acht was explicitly referred to with they/them pronouns in promotional materials throughout pretty much every region. The original Japanese also continued its trend of referring to Acht with more masculine terminology than feminine. For example, Acht uses the first-person pronoun boku, which, from what I've been able to gather in my research, is more stereotypically associated with masculinity than femininity. Though, from my little understanding of the Japanese language, masculinity versus femininity with these pronouns is more associated with the vocal inflection with which they're delivered. Regardless, the use of they/them in the promotional material is a lot more direct than it was with Shiver, where they avoided using pronouns wherever possible. With her, it seems honestly like they were still deciding whether or not Shiver would be non-binary as the promotional materials were coming out, and ultimately they decided to leave it ambiguous. But with Acht, it definitely seems a lot more intentional, as they've not been referred to as she/her since those original English promotional tweets. This also held true when Side Order eventually released earlier this year, with Acht and all of the other characters referring to them exclusively by they/them. And considering how high profile their role in the story mode is, and the way their backstory is fleshed out through the completion rewards in Side Order, it's clear that a lot of effort went to bringing Acht into the forefront. The fact that their gender is represented so passively here is also really cool, and even though they don't explicitly use the term non-binary to describe them, it's very clear that Acht does not identify as a binary woman or man. We can pretty much say without a doubt they're non-binary, which makes it especially cool that Side Order essentially has the three most queer Splatoon characters all together in the same story mode, with Pearl and Marina pining for each other just constantly, like they never stop. Just leave it to Nintendo to remind us that fictional lesbians are a privilege, not a right.